Hey, you are now listening to the Graceway Podcast. Let's talk.
Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to Let's Talk. My name is Jeff Adams. I'm here with Pastor Tim Dunn. And Pastor Tim, we've been like ships passing in the night here the last month or two. We've both been traveling a lot. And Sunday was Mother's Day.
It was.
And we're going to talk about your Mother's Day message, which was not necessarily directed at moms.
Right.
But you said something that maybe nobody else picked up but me. And I want to give you some kudos because you had your 20th anniversary the week before.
Right.
And you took your bride and did something special and let Pastor Todd preach.
Yeah.
Now, the reason that picks up on me, because back in my generation, we put duty ahead of everything. We were very sincere.
Sure.
But, all that type of stuff. So sometimes we were not as present. And so when I heard you say that, I'm going, attaboy, Pastor Tim. Way to set the example. So congratulations on 20 years of marriage. A special Mother's Day for you and Miss Ashley.
Yeah, absolutely.
But just great.
Yeah.
So we're talking about Solomon on Mother's Day.
Yeah.
And you picked up on the irony of that. A dude who had 700 wives and 300 concubines.
Yeah, exactly. Lots of moms on Mother's Day.
Exactly. A lot. Yeah, his Mother's Day were very expensive, just the flowers alone.
That's right.
But so anyway, I just wanted to ask you the question, as you prepared for this, what stands out in your mind as being the highlight of your preparation, or the thing that impressed you the most, or the thing that helped you as an individual the most as you studied the life of Solomon?
That's a great question. Yeah, he's such a complex guy, and we've talked about this before. I'm really grateful that God allows kind of the heroes of the faith to show their warts and their flaws and their brokenness. We'll talk about Solomon again this week, talk a little bit more about his failures and how he didn't finish as well as he began, and talk about finishing well, which is something you and I have talked a great deal about. But yeah, I think I just appreciate he's really dynamic and he's really broken at the same time, and that God saw fit to use him to build incredible things. Mm-hmm. God kept his word, that Davidic covenant, he's a big piece of that. God used him to build a really symbolic and powerful structure and infrastructure with the temple. And I think I just am grateful that God, this is simplistic, but I'm just grateful that God uses broken people to do significant, spiritual, eternal things.
And that's simple, but it's also deep and profound at the same time.
Sure.
Which leads me to another question, and again, you passed over this, not that you were trying to ignore it, but 700 wives, 300 concubines. Right. I mean, what's up with that? How do we put that in modern context? How do we contextualize that for today? What's up with that?
I don't know that we have. I'd be curious your thoughts. I don't know that we have an equivalent that we could moralize in any way, shape, or form. Obviously, this is a guy. A lot of those women would have had political attachments to them, would have had empire building aspirations connected to them. This was a time where kingdoms and families were connected through marriage, and very patriarchal, and so you had powerful men utilizing their family to build their empire. The Bible doesn't necessarily criticize the quantity in the same way that we would. What it criticizes is the fact that he allowed his heart to be taken away from the Lord through these relationships. And so obviously in our context, like, what kind of terrible low life, and it's interesting. I mean, this would be an interesting conversation. The Bible doesn't really do that. It doesn't do that with David. We know that David had lots of wives and probably lots of concubines as well. And even when David messes up with Bathsheba, it refers to his sin as being toward Uriah, toward the Hittite. Like, he killed this guy. I don't know, I think there's a lot of cultural things that are going on there, but I think with Solomon, he was a guy who had a bit of spiritual ADD, right? He just always seemed to lose focus on his priorities, on the wisdom that God had given him, on God himself, whether it be money or partying. I mean, this is the book of Ecclesiastes, like his pursuits of fulfillment and fun and purpose, and how easily he got distracted. So obviously there's pieces of non-monogamous behavior that we would be rightly critical of. But I don't think that the Bible, and again, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, the Bible doesn't seem to overly emphasize that as much as its effect on him.
It seems like we categorize sins in order.
Yeah, that's
and
true.
our order is
Yeah.
usually the reverse of God's.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's not to justify a non-monogamous marriage. It's not.
Yeah.
That's not the point.
No.
But the point is, we can lie, we can cheat, we
Yeah.
can steal, we can gossip.
Yeah.
Things that would be horribly offensive in biblical society.
Yeah.
But yet that's okay.
Yeah, and obviously there are other places that God is very, very clear, be faithful to.
Absolutely.
One woman or to one
That's
man.
been his plan from the beginning.
That's his plan,
No matter
yeah.
how many
Not
times
Adam
we
and
break
Eve
that.
and Sally. Yeah. So the blueprint is not up for debate. What you're saying, though, is God trying to make a point around Solomon, and what I'm saying is monogamy isn't his point around Solomon.
Exactly.
That's all.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So here's a question for you that somebody asked me, asking for a friend. Okay.
Great.
You mentioned David and Bathsheba just
Yeah.
a moment ago.
Yeah.
And when we talk about that, especially those of us that preach and teach and things like that,
Yeah.
we tend to put the emphasis on what's up with David. How's this affecting him? What
Yeah.
was right? What was wrong? All of
Right.
this. What's up with Bathsheba? How come nobody ever mentions how this affected her or what her position is?
Yeah, and she's in a pretty difficult position, right? I mean, David.
In terms of culture, she cannot refuse a king.
Yeah.
There's no way out of that.
Yeah, exactly. And as devastating as that was, the scripture doesn't say a lot about her, but is not overly critical of her either. And Solomon makes some references to his mom at certain times that are really positive. And so, I don't know, man. I mean, that whole story, I tried to reframe David and Goliath a
Right.
couple weeks ago in a way that I think is more biblically faithful than some of the ways that we do. But there's so much going on culturally in all of these stories that we just don't have a framework for.
It's hard for us to understand
It is.
in the Western modern world. But the reason I ask you that question, I have a motive
Yeah, I'm
underneath
sure,
that
yeah,
because
yeah.
you had mentioned also some of what I'll call your pet projects, and I don't mean that in an offensive way,
Oh,
but
sure.
things that really mean something to you.
Yeah.
Bible translation,
Yeah.
and then you announced again that a few months ago this church was able to give $35,000 to an anti-trafficking ministry
Yeah.
that is doing a wonderful job. And the reason that kind of came up in my mind thinking about Bathsheba, as I said, culturally, there's probably nothing she could have done.
No.
And I wonder if you see any connection between women who are trafficked. That is not their fault.
Right.
They are victims.
Yeah.
And how can we respond to those women in a biblical way, knowing that they have been forced into prostitution, into pornography, into all types of things that we would be rightfully critical of, but through no real fault of their own?
Yeah, and you're saying, do I see anything in
A
Bathsheba?
parallel with Bathsheba.
A
king kills her husband and has sex with her.
Yeah, it's interesting. And for you guys who watch regularly, I don't have a clue what you're going to bring up. This is very off the cuff. We try to not
Sometimes
overscript
I don't
it.
have a clue.
We try to not overscript it just from the standpoint of wanting some authenticity to it. To be entirely honest with you, I hadn't made the connection, but that is more accurate than the way that I think particularly white evangelical Westerners tend to view Bathsheba. We tend to view it very morally, not very culturally, and we tend to over-assign motivation and responsibility to her, and you're right, she wouldn't have had much choice in the deal. She does lose a man who, by all accounts, was a very, very good man. We can assume he was a good husband. And so, there's a lot of loss there. And for her to lose the baby, for God to judge David and take the baby, you start thinking into those things. And even we don't know when she passed, but I think that it's it's reasonable to assume that she watched Solomon come to power and then really do some dumb things, you know, and having a daughter and two sons personally, just that's painful.
Yeah.
And so she really would have had a painful life. And in terms of the trafficking thing, I mean, I went into COVID with the Bible translation thing. I inherited from you a relationship with an organization called Seed Company. And the trafficking thing really kind of came more into the light for me during COVID. We have a relationship with and had done some research around. And it's, I don't know, I don't feel like words really get at the horror of what is happening in our world. The amount of loss, the amount of degrading, depraved, wicked, evil things that are happening. And, we don't like to view David as being capable of some of those things, but it does go back to my point. I mean, God could have very easily left the David and Bathsheba scenario out of David's story. He put it in. And it's way worse on David than we actually think that it is on the surface. Yeah. It's not just that he had an affair. I mean, really used another human being and killed another human being and made his general, complicit in that whole, I mean, it's a really broken, messed up family tree that comes from. And so, you got me thinking on.
Well, it just seems like in the church sometimes we are very selective in our moral outrage.
Yeah.
So some things, we can get all excited about.
Yeah.
Currently, the abortion thing is polarizing our society.
Yeah.
And there are points on both sides. We're not even going to go there right now.
Yeah.
But yet, human trafficking is there, and it seems like that's one of those things that we can often overlook.
Yeah, and out
of sight, out of mind.
I'm literally, we get done with this, I go into a staff meeting, I'm talking to the staff about, I don't know if this is where you want me to go or not, but talking to the staff about the Roe v. Wade thing. And to be clear, I'm definitely pro-life. I know that you are as well. Think that abortion, you look at the numbers around abortion, it's really hard to wrap your head around.
It is.
And the early church is really instructive for us around this issue. The early church would have been pro-life, but they would have been pro-whole life. Mm-hmm. And one of the key tenets of the early church was in response to, the genocide that was occurring in the Roman Empire, kids being exposed if they weren't wanted. We talk about raising our kids. That actually came from Roman culture, where a dad would raise a kid that he wanted. Toward the sun god, and that was the phrase. He raised him. And we talk about raising our kids. That's where it comes from. So you either raise kids or you exposed kids, which is you just left them out to die. We have more medical and tame ways of doing that, but still as horrific. And the church became known for its adoption processes during that, finding these exposed kids and bringing them into their family. And I'm afraid, this might be controversial. It shouldn't be, but it might be. I'm afraid that in all of our vigor around legislation on abortion, which I'm for, don't get me wrong, and now all of our celebration around the potential that Roe v. Wade could be overturned, that we are going to take, I don't even know if our foot has been on the gas, but that we are going to forget that we are called to service the whole of life. And so for families that are doing adoption, for families that are fostering, man, I really celebrate them.
Yeah, we should celebrate that.
Yeah,
exactly.
I celebrate them more, if I'm honest, than some of the legislation, as important as it is, because I think the actual work of being pro-life is a little more sacrificial than casting a ballot, or voting for the right person. And I hope that the church doesn't celebrate and say, well, now we're good. And I hope that this is now a space where, okay, if in God's sovereignty this is changing in our country, now let's turn our attention towards some of the social structures that put women in a position where they feel like that's their only option, some of the racial issues that are implicit, some of the economic issues, adoption, fostering. I mean, I worked in a lot of people don't know this, I worked in a pregnancy care center in Cincinnati, in urban Cincinnati, while I was pastoring there. And I don't even really know how, and frankly, I don't even really know why, other than for what I'm about to say. It was amazing to me to watch the type of young woman that would come in, the color of her skin, her economic standing, and then to watch white folks from the burbs coming in to picket Planned Parenthood down I mean, abortion is obviously a moral issue, but it's not only a moral issue. There's social issues, there's economic issues, and as a church, we got to develop our peripheral vision a little bit more on.
I guess that's why that was on my heart, Pastor
Yeah.
Tim, as we talk about these issues. Again, if the Old Testament teaches us anything, it's that you cannot legislate morality.
That's exactly right.
You can't do that.
Yeah,
And while you and I
and not that you can, it just doesn't work.
It doesn't work, exactly. And you can, but and we support good legislation, and we're against bad legislation.
Exactly.
We're all in agreement on that.
Yeah.
But that does not guarantee that people are going to morally respond.
That's exactly
and
right.
that's the strong point of the church.
That's exactly right.
We have moral high ground.
Yes, that's exactly right. As long as we do have moral high ground.
Yeah, as long as we stay there.
As long as we stay there.
Yeah.
And that's been one of the grieving things about this last season. I say this all the time. You and I go to lunch and we're talking through all of these issues. One of the most grieving things is to watch the church become polarized politically.
Yes.
I mean, of all the things.
Yes, and we can disagree about certain political issues.
Yeah.
That's not the point.
Yeah, but yeah. So, on the Roe v. Wade thing, that's funny how you got us all.
We started with Solomon.
Yeah, I didn't even see it coming. Yeah, and then when you referenced the, I want to be clear, especially because the seat that you sat in here for many years and the seat that I sat in, there's a lot of different perspectives on. But as a church, let's be pro-life, but let's be whole pro-life. And let's be honest around some of these issues, and let's be grateful if our country, for whatever its actual reasons are,
Right.
is changing this legislation. But let's also really double down on caring for human life, prenatal and postnatal, and being sacrificial in those services. I think that's pleasing to God.
Drawing it back to your sermon.
Yeah, sure.
and that's fine. That's why we do this. That's why we talk.
Yeah,
We just simply talk.
Right.
But at the end of the sermon, you came back and you were giving us instructions on what to do when we feel depleted.
Yeah.
And you'd made a distinction between being tired and being depleted, which if you didn't see Pastor Tim's sermon, go back and listen to that very carefully. Great point. But you made a statement in that process. One of the steps that you gave us was to seek God's glory.
Yeah.
And you said something in that moment. You said that we should seek God's glory, give even for foreigners and strangers.
Yeah.
And the point that I saw on that is just what we're talking about. The church today, I think, is in danger of entering into tribalism.
Yes.
And rather than turning ourselves outward, how can we establish God's glory among people who don't know Him, among people who don't vote like we do, who don't look like we do, who don't think like we do?
Yeah.
How can we do that?
Yeah, and I think it's even worse than that, right? Because I think now the church is tired and is depleted and doesn't know how to refill and is trusting human structures to give us victories that only God can. I think to go back to the Roe v. Wade thing or any of these other issues, right? Like, you can only win spiritual battles through spiritual means.
Yeah, and it seems like the pandemic kind of ripped the screen away from the Oz.
Yeah,
and the church was revealed for its weakness and superficiality in a lot of areas of life. And now we're struggling to figure out where do we go from here.
I think that's true, but I also just think there's a lot of great churches and a lot of great Christians, and I think people are tired and we're worn out, and we don't know. We thought that once the pandemic was over, okay, now we're good.
Yeah.
And what we're finding out is that we're having a hard time getting out.
Exactly.
And so what I was trying to say for those that didn't see it is, Solomon is standing in front of this temple and he's asking God to fill it.
Exactly.
And he has this mindset of what will compel or entice God's Spirit to fill this temple. God says we're His temple. Mm-hmm. If we're feeling depleted, is it possible that Solomon's prayer is instructive for us? And so, I talked about gratitude, the Spirit's attracted to gratitude. I talked about grace, the Spirit's attracted to humility and surrender. And then I talked about God's glory. Mm-hmm. And it is amazing how baked into the Old Testament the idea of the foreigner is. Mm-hmm. And when God blessed Israel, it was for the nations. Mm-hmm. It says over and over and over again. Yeah. And I think that we do what Israel did. We can't conceive that God's blessing is supposed to be beyond us. Right. Right. And so we do get tribal, and we do get insular, and we do get self-serving around these things. And so, how do we? I think we have to be honest about where we are, actually, mm-hmm. About what we love, actually, about what is filling us or what we're pursuing, actually, and then this is so preachy, but we really have to ask ourselves if we do love the things that God loves, and if we are seeing the fruit that God mm-hmm. says we'll see from those realities. And for me, back to the human trafficking thing, human trafficking and Bible translation, I can't think of two things more at the top of God's list than His Word and people. And so I am hoping at Graceway that we can simplify some things. I'm hoping at Graceway that we can get a little bit more humble, a little bit more honest about where we actually are and who we actually are. And I'm hoping that God will reveal Himself to us in such a way and give us a vision and a heart to really love some of the things that He loves. And that maybe coming out of this pandemic and out of this season, that the church can actually redistinguish itself. I think that there's the potential with all the political and division, all of those kind of things, for the church to do a reset in a really beautiful, helpful way.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think that's going to be one of the positive things coming out of the pandemic and all the divisiveness and whatnot. But I think it comes back to the principle that you mentioned early on in this podcast. And that's simply the principle of knowing that God works through broken people.
Yeah, sure.
And He works through broken churches.
Yeah.
There is not a church that is not broken in some way. There's not a person who is not broken in some way.
Right.
And it's to God's glory that He uses us.
That's right.
But that humility, and I love, Pastor Tim, your holistic emphasis that we can't be a one-issue people.
Right.
We've got to see life holistically.
We do.
And even if we could solve human problem, if we could translate the Bible into every language, there's still justice issues, there are racial issues, there are economic and educational issues.
Yeah.
I mean, we can make a longer list.
Yeah, it's pretty overwhelming. Yeah.
Yeah. But that all goes back, and we're just about out of time, but one statement that you made at the end that I wrote down is that the Spirit of God is attracted to surrender.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm hearing you say, to turn this whole pandemic and divisiveness into something positive.
Yeah.
If we can just surrender control of our life to God, we're going to be in a better place.
Yeah, and I you and I think rightly can be critical of the Western church. I also do want to say there's lots of very good men and women, very good leaders who are in a spot of saying, God, I don't know, man. I don't know what you're doing, where you have me, that I'm worn out, but I really want you to use my life. I really want you to I want you to glorify yourself in my life. And I'm deeply encouraged by that.
I'm deeply encouraged as well. Sometimes as we've taught the history of Christianity and whatnot, we talk about how England at one time was the missionary light of the world, and the Netherlands and countries like that. And then we tend to get very critical.
We do.
Because those countries now tend to be somewhat dark spiritually.
Sure.
But in the darkness are some wonderful churches and wonderful believers who are totally engaged in God's mission.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's what I think, there's more people in the global south that are Christians now than there are in the north by a lot.
Yeah.
Almost 3/4 of the world do not look like us who are Christians.
Yeah.
But yet that should not be a cause of alarm for us, but of satisfaction. We prayed for that day.
Absolutely.
And now what's our place?
That's right. Well, yeah, I think that we still have a place.
Absolutely we do.
And we do have to take our more humble seat at the table. We do have to stop thinking that dollars earn you credit and control. And we have to get a little more humble and a little bit more generous. I mean, this is one of the most financially blessed churches in the history of the church, if not the most blessed. And we need to be a little bit more free and joining what God's doing in other places. Yeah.
Words of wisdom. Hey, this has been fun. This is why we do this,
That's
right?
right.
We have fun, and we're glad when you listen to us. All right. And as a reminder, you can find Let's Talk wherever you get your podcast. Please subscribe, leave us some kind reviews, and all that type of stuff. Invite your friends, and we will be back with you 1 week from today.
Thanks for tuning into the Graceway Experience. Hope we can talk again sometime.